Paul, I think you'd better go now.
At 79, the woman who guarded Elizabeth Taylor's most private life finally breaks her silence. Not a biographer, not a distant friend, her personal secretary. She says there was a box, small, wooden, tucked behind old scripts in Elizabeth's London apartment. Inside, dozens of envelopes sealed with violet wax. The handwriting on most of them was unmistakable. Richard Burton. For years, we thought their story ended in diamonds and divorces, the yacht weddings, the shouting headlines, the second chance that cracked just like the first. But these pages tell a different story, one the cameras never caught and the tabloids never earned. Some letters were never mailed. Some returned with the same cold stamp, returned to sender. Others read like confessions written at 3 a.m. Ink rushed. Sentences unfinished. A voice trying to put out a fire by describing it. The secretary remembers Elizabeth's rule: lock the box. If anyone ever asks, say there was nothing to see. Why hide love letters when the whole world already believed in their love? Because the letters didn't prove the legend. They corrected it. Picture the first envelope the secretary dared to open. The paper is thin as breath. The date 1974. The year of their first divorce. Burton's voice on the page is not the Welsh thunder from talk shows. It's a man begging the silence to answer back. Now, picture Elizabeth's reply. Written in violet ink, fewer words, sharper edges. The kind of honesty that ends scenes and changes lives. Together, the letters map a private marriage inside the public one, not Antony and Cleopatra, not Liz and Dick, but two people who loved like a weather system, beautiful, dangerous, unpredictable. Why keep this hidden? Because myth sells. Because truth doesn't sparkle. Because some loves are too loud to live in daylight. And because if the world had read these pages at the time, it would have asked the wrong questions and given the wrong verdict. The secretary says the box was locked for decades. When Elizabeth laughed for the cameras, the box was locked. When she remarried, the box was locked. When they divorced again, it stayed locked. And when Richard died in 1984, when the world thought the curtain finally fell, Elizabeth placed one more letter inside and turned the key. What was in that last letter? Why did Burton write to her and then never send the words that might have saved them? And what single line did Elizabeth write? The day before his funeral. That the secretary calls the only honest ending to the loudest love story in Hollywood? This isn't the tale you've been sold about jewels and jealousy. It's the record of something far rarer, two souls trying to turn passion into peace and failing beautifully. Tonight, for the first time, the lock is broken. The letters speak. And the question is no longer whether Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton loved each other. The question is, what did that love cost, and why did it have to be buried to survive, stay? Listen. The truth doesn't glitter. It burns. To the outside world, they were untouchable. Elizabeth Taylor, the violet-eyed queen who could make a camera fall in love, and Richard Burton, the Welsh thunder who spoke like Shakespeare, reincarnated. Together, they look like destiny sculpted in flesh. When Cleopatra premiered in 1963, the headlines called it the most expensive love story ever filmed. They weren't wrong. The movie cost $44 million. Their affair cost both of them their marriages, their privacy, and eventually, their peace. But to the world, that price only made them fascinating. On magazine covers, they were pure mythology, the perfect blend of beauty, power, and sin. In every photograph, she's glowing. He's looking at her like she's the last real thing on earth. They made love look like an empire, loud, brilliant, impossible to ignore. But myths always lie behind the glamour. They were already at war with the life they had built. Their days began with champagne and ended with silence. Elizabeth, wrapped in diamonds. I've learned to smile even when she felt the weight of the world pressing down. She once said, "People think beauty makes you happy. It doesn't. It just makes you watched." Burton, the miner's son turned movie god, was haunted by the gap between who he was and who the world wanted him to be. He drank not to celebrate, but to disappear one glass at a time. On film sets, they were electric. Between takes, they were exhausted. Their love scenes burned with a truth no director could script. But when the camera stopped, that same fire turned inward. They argued like artists who knew words could wound deeper than knives. He accused her of caring too much about fame. She accused him of hiding behind alcohol. Then they'd collapse into each other, desperate and afraid to be alone. A makeup artist once said, "You never knew what you'd find when you knocked on their dressing room door: laughter, music, or broken glass." In public, they wore perfection like armor. When reporters asked about their fights, Elizabeth smiled and said, "We argue passionately because we love passionately." The quote ran on front pages worldwide. Fans adored it. The myth of Liz and Dick became immortal. But inside their home, love was no longer cinematic. It was survival. He would sit in the corner, chain smoking, quoting poetry to the empty air. She would wander through rooms too large for silence, wearing jewels that felt like anchors. Fame had turned them into prisoners in a palace. There's a photograph from 1969. They're walking through the airport surrounded by bodyguards. Flashbulbs explode around them. She looks radiant, smiling. But if you look at the picture long enough, you notice her hand clenched, not holding his. The world thought they had everything. In truth, they were two people drowning in applause. At night, Elizabeth would stand before the mirror, removing her makeup layer by layer until her face belonged to no one. She once told a friend, "The hardest part about being loved by millions is learning that love doesn't keep you warm." Burton, meanwhile, wrote in his diary, "I am afraid of her eyes. They see the real me, and I am not sure I like that man." They were perfect only when performing. That was their tragedy. When they married for the first time in 1964, the world celebrated. Paparazzi followed them through Paris, Rome, New York, every step recorded, every argument amplified. When they remarried in 1975, the applause returned, but the warmth didn't. "We were trying to find the ending we never got to play," Elizabeth admitted later. In private, they both knew the truth. The image had devoured the intimacy. Richard once told a journalist, "We created a monster. The world doesn't see us anymore. It sees them Burton and Taylor, and there's no room left for Richard and Elizabeth." That line never made it to print. His publicist removed it, calling it too bleak. But it was the most honest thing he ever said. Fame had turned their love into a brand. And like all brands, it demanded maintenance diamonds, gossip, appearances, the illusion of control. The louder the applause grew, the less they heard each other. They became addicted to the noise. Silence frightened them. When they tried to live quietly, they fought. When they fought, they reconciled just to feel alive again. Their life together was a cycle of escape and return, burning bridges only to rebuild them out of habit. One night, during a party in Rome, Burton stood up from the table, drunk but lucid, and said, "We are not lovers. We are evidence." Everyone laughed, thinking it was a joke. Elizabeth didn't. Later, in her room, she reportedly told him, If love is evidence, then what are we proving? He didn't answer. He just kissed her forehead and whispered that we existed. The perfect image had already cracked, but they didn't know how to live without it. In 1974, when the first divorce papers were signed, Elizabeth stared at the signature and said, "It looks like the ending of a movie, the one I never wanted to make." Richard answered, "Then, well, write another one." A year later, they did. They remarried. The world cheered. But this time the applause sounded different, distant, hollow, like an echo trapped inside a shell. They were no longer gods. They were human again, and it terrified them. To the press, their reunion was redemption. To them, it was déjà vu, a beautiful illusion repeating itself. As Elizabeth once said, "We loved each other too much to live quietly, and too loudly to last forever." And in that single sentence, the myth of perfection finally shattered. The box had been locked for decades. When the secretary finally opened it, the air itself seemed to remember the faint scent of violet perfume, old paper, and time that had waited too long to speak. Inside lay 34 letters, most addressed simply to Liz, each one in Richard Burton's uneven handwriting, as if his emotions had spilled faster than his pen could follow. The first letter was dated March 1974, 2 weeks after their first divorce. "My Lizzie, we've shouted ourselves into silence. And in that silence, I can still hear your voice. I have lived every role, king, poet, sinner, but I was only ever true when you were watching. You are my audience and my judge. And without you, I am just a man who forgot his lines." He never mailed it. When Elizabeth found it later, hidden among his scripts, she wrote her own reply in violet ink. "Richard, I used to believe love was a jewel, something you could hold, polish, show the world. But ours was fire, not diamond. It couldn't shine quietly. It could only burn." That was how they spoke when the world wasn't listening, through letters, through silence, through pain. As the secretary read through each page, she said it felt like watching two people fall in love all over again and destroy themselves in the same breath. One letter from Burton began in drunken rage, ended in trembling devotion. "You make me mad. Lizzie, you make me weak. I cannot breathe without hating you a little, and I cannot hate you without wanting you completely. We are both cursed. My darling. But what a magnificent curse it is." Another, written by Elizabeth a year later, carried only 5 words. "You are still my home." He answered with a single line, "Then I will never move out." They were addicted to each other's chaos. The letters became their second marriage, one written in ink, not law. By the late 1972, they had both remarried other people, but the letters continued. Elizabeth's husband found one once, half finished on her vanity. It read, "He sends me books instead of apologies now. He underlines the lines he can't say aloud. I pretend I don't notice, but I always read them twice." When asked about Burton in an interview, Elizabeth smiled and said, "He's part of my bloodstream." It sounded poetic. It was literal. In one of his last letters, Richard confessed, "I stopped drinking for 6 months. It didn't help. I still felt drunk on the idea of you." She replied, "If love is a sickness, I am not looking for a cure." The letters weren't always romantic. Some were confessions. Some were wounds. He told her about the loneliness of fame, how he hated the echo of applause after the curtains closed. "They clap for me, Lizzie, but they don't see me. You were the only one who ever did." She wrote back, "And you, Richard, were the only man who ever loved me enough to destroy me." That was the language they shared, honesty too heavy for daylight. One letter stood out among the rest. The secretary said her hand shook when she found it. It was written on hotel stationery from Geneva, 3 days before Burton's death in 1984. He had scribbled across the top, for her eyes only. Lizzie, I dream of you every night, sometimes as Cleopatra, sometimes as the girl who laughed at my bad jokes. I think of your hands, always moving when you talk, always alive. I've had 1,000 scenes, 1,000 partners, but none who could keep me awake just by breathing. If I go first, keep the letters. Let them be our witnesses. We loved each other too loudly for heaven. I don't think God knows what to do with that kind of noise. He signed it simply, R. That was the last letter he ever wrote. When news of Burton's death reached her, Elizabeth locked herself in her room for 3 days. No diamonds, no cameras, no statements. Only the box. She opened it one final time and wrote back, not to send, but to finish what had started. My darling Richard, the doctors say your heart gave out, but I know better. It was never strong enough for the way we loved. I forgive you for the things you couldn't say, and I forgive myself for hearing too much. If love is noise, then let the silence now belong to us. She folded the letter, kissed the paper, and placed it on top of his. Then she locked the box again and whispered to the secretary, Promise me no one reads this until I am gone. The secretary promised, and she kept that promise for almost 30 years. When Elizabeth Taylor died in 2011, the box was found exactly where she had left it, under her bed, wrapped in a faded silk scarf. The key was inside an envelope with her handwriting, for the truth. The letters were read aloud for the first time that year, privately, by the woman who had served her for decades. She said it was like listening to ghosts speak in the language of fire. Everyone saw their passion. The secretary said, but only these pages show their tenderness. One letter had been written on the back of an old movie script. It ended with words that could have been their epitaph. We were never meant to last, only to be remembered. Their story was never about tragedy. It was about the rare, terrifying kind of love that refuses to die even when the people in it do. They weren't perfect. They weren't peaceful. But they were real. And maybe that's why the world still looks for them in old films, in headlines, in the quiet ache of lovers who never quite let go. Because somewhere, in the faint scent of perfume and old paper, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton are still writing to each other, not to ask for forgiveness, but to remind us that some loves don't end. They just change rooms. The world thought the story was over. Burton was gone. The tabloids had moved on. And Elizabeth Taylor had become a legend surrounded by diamonds, fading lights, and the ghosts of her own beauty. But the box still waited. When Elizabeth's secretary finally dared to open the bottom compartment, she found a second envelope, sealed with red wax instead of violet. Inside was a single letter, written not by Burton, but by Elizabeth herself. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the words cut clean. For Richard, they told me you died of a weak heart, but I know better. You died of love, because love, my darling, was the only thing you never learned to ration. She had written it the night before his funeral. The handwriting was steady, but the words were trembling. You always feared the silence after applause. Now the world is silent, and I'm afraid of the noise. They will call this tragedy, Richard. But you and I, we know better. We live louder than the world could stand. That was the letter no one had seen until now. The secretary, her voice shaking, said, I think this was the only time Elizabeth Taylor wrote without performing. What followed was even more shocking. Tucked behind that page was a photograph creased, almost torn. It showed the two of them in Switzerland, sitting on a balcony after dinner. No cameras, no makeup, just her head resting on his shoulder. On the back, Burton had written in his familiar scrawl, "This is how I want to be remembered. Not the films, not the fame. Just this." The secretary whispered. She kept this photo until the end. Even after all the marriages, all the men, this was the one image she never replaced. When the letters were quietly passed to Elizabeth's children years later, one of them asked, why didn't she ever publish them? The secretary replied, because the world had already stolen too much. She wanted to keep one truth for herself. In the final months of her life, Elizabeth often sat by her window, the letters on her lap. She couldn't read them anymore. Her eyesight had dimmed, but she would trace her fingers along the handwriting like someone touching a memory that still breathed. A nurse once asked, "Miss Taylor, do you ever regret it?" Elizabeth smiled faintly. "No. I just regret that love like ours doesn't last long enough to learn how to be quiet." Years later, the letters were authenticated, dated, and archived not for tabloids, not for profit, but as part of a private foundation she created for the arts. She left one final note attached to them, written on the same stationery she had used for Burton decades earlier. "Do not publish until it stops hurting." That line became the key to understanding everything that came before the marriages. The divorces, the fights, the jewels, the laughter that sounded too loud to be happy. Elizabeth Taylor had been many things: actress, icon, survivor. But above all, she was the keeper of a truth that Hollywood could never sell, that some loves don't die, they simply change shape. For decades, people asked what made their story so unforgettable. Was it beauty, fame, tragedy? No. It was honesty. Brutal, inconvenient, and impossible to market. He once said, "We loved each other too much to survive it." She proved him right and wrong, because even after death, that love survived in ink and paper, in scent and silence. It wasn't immortality they found. It was memory. The most heartbreaking discovery came in 2010, a year before Elizabeth's death. The secretary, cleaning out an old cabinet, found one last sealed envelope addressed to whoever still remembers us. Inside was a short note, almost like a benediction. "Don't look for the scandal. Look for the humanity. We were loud because silence frightened us. But every fight, every tear, every reckless kiss was real. I don't want to be remembered as perfect. I want to be remembered as honest." The secretary said she left the note exactly where she found it because some truths aren't meant to be moved. And that was the real shock. The revelation wasn't a secret affair, or hidden child, or betrayal. It was something simpler and infinitely rarer. That the greatest love story in Hollywood history had nothing to do with glamour at all. It was about two people who refused to fake feeling, even when it destroyed them. They were not victims of fame. They were victims of their own authenticity. At the end of her life, Elizabeth told a friend, "People think I collected jewels. But what I really collected were moments that could never happen twice." And among all her treasures, the letters were the only ones she never gave away. Because that was her real inheritance, not diamonds, not fame, but a story that still feels alive every time someone says their names together. And now, with those letters finally revealed, the myth of Elizabeth and Richard is complete. Not perfect, not pure, but true. Because what they left behind wasn't a scandal. It was proof that love, even when broken, can echo forever. When the cameras fade and the lights stop burning, what remains of love? Not the beauty, not the applause, just the echo. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were never a fairy tale, they were a mirror. In them, we see every contradiction that makes love human, the need to be seen, the fear of being known, the hunger to be understood, even if it means breaking in the process. The world called their story excessive, scandalous, doomed. But what if it was simply honest? What if the chaos wasn't failure, but proof that love, in its rawest form, refuses to be polite? In a world that edits passion into perfection, they dared to live unedited. They taught us that love isn't about harmony, it's about recognition, the brief moment when two people see each other completely and still choose to stay, even when it hurts. They didn't conquer eternity, they collided with it. And in that collision, they left behind something purer than legend, truth. Every jewel fades. Every photograph gathers dust. But the letters, those trembling words written between pride and forgiveness, remain. They remind us that even when love burns too brightly to last, the light it leaves behind still warms the dark. So perhaps eternity isn't how long a love survives, but how deeply it is remembered. And maybe the loudest love stories are the ones that whisper long after the curtain falls.